Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to a slightly different video, because today we're going to be going through a list of the 100 greatest novels ever published in 1899. So, I'm sure many of you remember the list that went round last year of the New York Times best books of the 21st century. A lot of people were commenting on this, finding it very, very interesting, and I got the impression from people watching that video that everyone really likes a list. Then a couple of weeks ago, I was watching a video by Nicole from Noteworthy Fiction. I'll leave her channel link down below. And Nicole mentioned in passing a list that she had found of the 100 greatest novels that was published in 1899. So, you know, what the people at the end of the 19th century thought were the greatest novels ever. And I thought this was fascinating. And then I found the list online, and I thought it might be interesting to go through this list and have a look at what, you know, the late Victorians thought were the greatest novels ever. So this list was initially published as an article by the Daily Telegraph, a British newspaper, in 1899, and it went through 100 novels that the editors considered to be the best novels ever. The list was selected by the editor of the Daily Telegraph, along with a few other people: Sir Edwin Arnold, H.D. Trail, and W.L. Courtney. No idea who any of those people are. I'm sure it will be a list reflecting the biases of the 1890s. I imagine it will be very white and male and British, but I think it will be kind of fascinating to see what the critics of 1899 considered the greatest novels, how many of them we still read and hear about, how many have just been lost to time entirely, and also if there are any like very famous classics that aren't on that list that I would kind of expect to be there. So I think it'll be quite an interesting exercise. I found the list online. It's not the original Daily Telegraph article, so it's the list, but like the descriptions of the books are not from 1899, but I still thought it would be quite interesting to go through. So I'm going to move over to my computer and carry on with the video. So hello again, we're now here at my computer and we're going to go through the Daily Telegraph's 100 best novels list from 1899. I'll leave a link down below to where you can find this list, and yeah, I think it'll be quite interesting to take a look at this list. So we're starting off weekly with some William Harrison Ainsworth. In fact, 3 William Harrison Ainsworth. This is fascinating. So I've read one book by William Harrison Ainsworth. He is a Victorian author. I've read The Lancashire Witches earlier, I was about to say earlier this year, no, last year in 2024 for Victober, and I thought it was bad. I had many problems with it, but I thought it was such a slog and the writing was just not great. And yeah, I will leave down below my Victober wrap-up if you want to hear more of my thoughts of William Harrison Ainsworth's The Lancashire Witches, but it definitely didn't encourage me to read lots more by William Harrison Ainsworth. But it does seem that in 1899 he was very well respected. It's interesting that here we have the Tower of London, Old St Paul's and Windsor Castle, because I don't think these are still in print. I think the only one of his books that is sort of properly still in print is The Lancashire Witches, but obviously in 1899 he was hugely respected, so that's very fascinating. So I haven't read them, but I have read something by the author. But now we come to some Jane Austen, so that's lovely. Yes, I have read both Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, and they are great. Nice to see that Jane Austen was highly respected and considered, you know, very important in 1899. She's quite an interesting one actually, because like as the 19th century went on, she became kind of more respected. So by the late 19th century, she was kind of more popular and more respected than she had been in the mid 19th century, which I find quite interesting. Then here we have Father Goriot by Honoré de Balzac, which I have read. I quite liked this. I didn't love it. I think probably I need to give Balzac another try and maybe try him on audiobook, because I didn't hugely gel with the writing style, but sometimes that is different for me when I listen to something on audiobook. But that is a book that I have read and that is still in print and still very well respected. Oh, a J.M. Barrie novel I've never heard of, A Window in Thrums. Fascinating. So this is a novel about rural Scottish life in the late 19th century. J.M. Barrie is obviously most known for his children's book and play, Peter Pan, but I've never heard of The Window in Thrums, so maybe I should give that a go. And also, I guess J.M. Barrie is mostly known for like his early 20th century stuff, but obviously he was writing in the late 19th century, so yeah. Okay, I'm gonna keep a list of things that I might want to read in the future. The Golden Butterfly by Walter Besant and James Rice. Not a book I have ever heard of at all. So another Victorian novel. This is about an actress's rise to fame. Not a book I've ever come across. I do find it really interesting to see, what was considered, a really important, significant book in 1899 that maybe has been completely forgotten now. And obviously maybe this list in 1899 was, like the New York Times list that came out last year, where a lot of people were like, I've never heard of that. Is that really considered one of the best books for the last few years? So who knows? Anyway, Robbery Under Arms by Rolf Boldrewood. No, that's not a novel I've ever heard of. This is about adventure and crime in the Australian bush. Not a book I've heard of. But here we have some books I have heard of. So here we have Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, which I do agree is an excellent book. And it's really nice to see this on this list, actually, because Mary Elizabeth Braddon was a sensation fiction writer, and she was often kind of looked down upon a little bit in the Victorian period for being very, very commercial. She wrote a lot of novels. So it's quite nice to see that in 1899 she was put on a list of best books, because I think she is a fantastic writer. And then after that we have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which is one of my favourite books ever and I love very much. A wonderful Billings-Roman. And look, next we have another book by Charlotte Bronte, Shirley, another wonderful novel that I think is great. I don't love it quite as much as Jane Eyre, but I do think it's a great novel with some really interesting characters, especially Shirley is a fascinating character. She's not the main character. The main character is called Caroline. Shirley doesn't appear for ages in the novel, but she is a great character. Okay, some other books I have not come across before. The Deemster by Hall Caine. Reading the description of this, this sounds quite interesting. It's set on the Isle of Man in the 19th century about a young man who is disowned by his father and then works his way up to become a judge. It makes me think of The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. I'm kind of be interested to read that. It'd be quite interesting to read a book about the Isle of Man from the 19th century. And then next we have Valentine Vox by Henry Cocteau, not a novel I've ever heard of, about a young man who's a ventriloquist. That sounds very random. A satirical commentary in 19th century England. Never come across that one before. Fascinating. But here we are in more familiar ground with two books by Wilkie Collins, both of which I have read, The Woman in White and The Moonstone. I agree that these are excellent, excellent books. Really, really worth a read. Wilkie Collins is a great writer of sensation fiction, really interesting novels, really compelling characters, really interesting use of form as well, really innovative writer. I will leave some links down below to videos where I've spoken about Wilkie Collins and more. And then what next? The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. In fact, we've got a few novels by James Fenimore Cooper all in a row. The Last of the Mohicans, The Pathfinder and The Prairie. I haven't read anything by James Fenimore Cooper. I have heard of The Last of the Mohicans. I haven't heard of the other two. I think these are kind of early American literature, looking at early American settler culture, I guess. I don't feel like they will be especially high up on my list, but it's interesting to see, how respected they were in 1899. Next we have Mr. Isaacs by F. Marion Crawford. So I haven't heard of Mr. Isaacs, I don't think, but F. Marion Crawford does ring a bell. And this actually sounds like a really interesting novel looking at the description. So it's set in British colonial India, following the love story, I guess, of an Afghan diamond merchant and an English woman. This novel is from 1882 and is apparently very critical of imperial rule, so I think that'll be a really interesting one, maybe one to add to my list. I think F. Marion Crawford is an American writer. And now we come on to some Charles Dickens, so, I'm going to have read one of these. They're obviously, I assume, not going to have all 14 of Charles Dickens's novels, so it'll be interesting to see which ones I have. So we have Martin Chuzzlewit, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop, Dombey and Son, very nice to see Dombey and Son, The Adventures of Oliver Twist. That's an interesting selection of Charles Dickens's books, to have Martin Chuzzlewit, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop, Dombey and Son, and Oliver Twist, because I feel like they are definitely not the most famous, well-respected Dickens books today. Oliver Twist is still very, very famous, but Great Expectations and A Tale of Two Cities are often the most widely respected of Dickens's books, I would say. I would say Nicholas Nickleby and Martin Chuzzlewit and The Old Curiosity Shop like are not Dickens's best loved books at all, and nor is Dombey and Son. Dombey and Son should be, because it's, you know, one of the absolute best ones, but it is one of Dickens's like lesser known books. In fact, all of these except for Oliver Twist I would say are in the like lower end of well-known Dickens books. Maybe Nicholas Nickleby is pretty well known, but like, yeah, this is an interesting selection of Charles Dickens's books. And Bleak House isn't here. Like, Bleak House is often held up as like the critical great. I am surprised by this Dickens list. I think I might have expected it to have the Pickwick Papers on, which is not super lauded today, but was hugely popular in the 19th century. So it's interesting to see like which Dickens books someone in 1899 decided were the best. And it's weird the Great Expectations and Bleak House aren't on there. Like, I wouldn't expect to see Our Mutual Friend on there, though it is my favourite, but I would expect to see Bleak House and Great Expectations, so that is very interesting. Okay, next we have The Firm of Grindlestone by Arthur Conan Doyle. Interesting. I have read some Arthur Conan Doyle. I have read lots and lots of Sherlock Holmes and a couple of other standalone novels. This novel is apparently about a corrupt company and some murder and fraud within it. So that sounds quite interesting. Never heard of this Arthur Conan Doyle before. Maybe I'll give this a try sometime. Okay, some French novels. We're on to some Alexandre Dumas. I have read 2 of these novels. So I read The Three Musketeers in January and really enjoyed it, and I've also read The Count of Monte Cristo, which I loved. So I would say I really like The Three Musketeers, but I don't love it as much as The Count of Monte Cristo, which is just amazing. I haven't read 20 Years After, which is a sequel to The Three Musketeers, but I would like to read it at some point. And yeah, I really like Alexandre Dumas. I think he's a fantastic writer, really wonderful novelist with rich characterization and a really wonderful, like, adventurous writing style. So yeah, excited to see some Alexandre Dumas on this list. Scenes of Clerical Life by George Eliot. What a random George Eliot to put on this list. Scenes of Clerical Life I haven't read. It's a collection of 3 novellas, which I hear people talk about occasionally, but like nowhere near as much as people talk about Middlemarch or Silas Marner or The Mill and the Floss. I would say that Scenes of Clerical Life nowadays lives kind of in the lesser known George Eliot pile with Felix Holt, the Radical, and Romola. And it's surprising to see Scenes of Clerical Life on here over Middlemarch. Fascinating look into the 1890s. Although, of course, you know, maybe it's not a fascinating look into the 1890s. Maybe it's just what 3 editors chose as their favourite books. It probably is that, but it's still quite interesting. Next, we have some Henry Fielding. We have Tom Jones and Joseph Andrews. Haven't heard of Joseph Andrews, have heard of Tom Jones, but haven't read it. I would quite like to read the history of Tom Jones, a foundling, because I have heard of it often, and it's meant to be quite an interesting kind of like early buildings roman, 18th century novel, I think. So maybe I'll read that at some point, but it's not like at the top of my list. And now some Elizabeth Gaskell, only one book by Elizabeth Gaskell. Mary Barton, interesting choice of Elizabeth Gaskell. I don't love it quite as much as North and South or Wives and Daughters, but I do love it, and I do think it's a fantastic novel with a really interesting plot, really interesting characterization, just really like worth your time. Elizabeth Gaskell is one of my favourite writers ever. It's like Charles Dickens at number 1, and then Jane Austen, Elizabeth Gaskell, and Anthony Trollope like all gathered together at number 2. And yeah, Elizabeth Gaskell is wonderful. Wonder if we're going to have any Anthony Trollope on here. Anyway, so now we've got some James Grant. Never heard of James Grant. Let's look him up. James Grant was apparently a Scottish Victorian writer. Interesting that I haven't heard of him and that I never came across him when I was researching for my Victorian authors series. I will leave links to that down below. I went through 100, I think, different Victorian authors and spoke about their work, and I didn't come across James Grant in my research, which is interesting because he obviously was respected in the late 19th century, more so than Elizabeth Gaskell, as we have 2 of his books here. So 2 historical novels set in the Napoleonic Wars, written, I guess, later on in the 19th century. Then next we have Gabriel Conroy by Bret Harte. Not a novel I know. Sounds like this is an American novel set in 19th century California. And next we have some Nathaniel Hawthorne. So I haven't read any Nathaniel Hawthorne, but I obviously have heard of Nathaniel Hawthorne. I must read The Scarlet Letter, actually, because that is one that has been, like I said, vaguely on my radar for a really long time. Elsie Venner by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Sounds like this is an American novel from 1861. I'd be interested to know, actually, for the American novels that I haven't heard of, whether if you're in the US you have heard of them, or whether they are not very famous in the US either. The Prisoner of Zendar by Anthony Hope. So I haven't read this one, but it is vaguely on my radar. I have heard of it. I would be interested in reading it. I think Anthony Hope was one of the authors in my 100 authors Victorian authors list. Next we have Tom Brown's School Days by Thomas Hughes. Not a novel that I have read, one I have been meaning to read and have vaguely intended to read before, one that I have definitely heard of. Pretty sure I have seen a screen adaptation of Tom Brown's School Days when I was younger. And now we come to some Victor Hugo. How many novels have we got by Victor Hugo here? We've got 3 novels by Victor Hugo. I have read 2 of them. So I've read Les Miserables and I've read The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I haven't read The Toilers of the Sea. I would really like to, actually, because this is one of his novels set in Guernsey. So Victor Hugo was exiled from France and ended up settling in Guernsey, which is a Channel island. If you don't know what the Channel Islands are, they are some islands that sit between England and France. And I went to Guernsey a couple of years ago and visited Victor Hugo's house on Guernsey, where he lived for many, many years while he was in exile. And it is a wild place. I'll put some pictures on the screen to show you, but Victor Hugo, like, he decorated his house in very weird ways, and he was also clearly like quite an egotist, because there are just like V's and H's carved everywhere. Like, he just carved his initials all over his house, and the decoration is wild. There's like a lot of tables made of old doors and like rooms that are decorated like all in tiles or all in wood. Anyway, so I'd be really interested to read The Toilers of the Sea, because that is set in Guernsey. That would be quite different and interesting. But yes, I have read Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Absolutely love Les Miserables. I haven't read it since I was a teenager, but I must reread it sometime. I think it's an incredible, incredible novel. I didn't like The Hunchback of Notre Dame as much. I did think it was interesting, but it didn't have the same like power for me as Les Miserables. But yes, I should read some more by Victor Hugo, and I should reread Les Miserables. Okay, so now we've got some Charles Kingsley, 3 novels by Charles Kingsley. So I have read some Charles Kingsley. I've read The Water Babies, but that was many a year ago and I don't remember it very well. I haven't read 2 years ago Alton Locke or Hippotatia. The only one of those 3 I've heard of is, I think, Alton Locke, which does ring a bell, and I probably would be vaguely interested in reading, as it's a social commentary Victorian novel, and I do love a social commentary Victorian novel. It looks like it's about the Chartist movement, which I find very interesting, so that might be an interesting read. Then 2 years ago sounds like it's about a kind of character's personal journey, and Hippotatia is a historical novel set in the early 5th century AD. That sounds interesting and unusual, so yeah. Fascinating. The next novel is a 19th century Australian novel, The Recollections of Geoffrey Hamlin by Henry Kingsley. Not a book I've heard of. Interested to know, if you're Australian, whether you've heard of that. Then now we have Soldiers 3 by Rudyard Kipling, which is a collection of short stories. Interesting that this is the Rudyard Kipling selection for this list, although I suppose actually quite a lot of his most famous things were not published by 1899. But obviously this is not a collection of short stories that I think is well known now. I have read some Rudyard Kipling. I find his writing very, very interesting. I think he's probably one of those writers where I like to read him for like historical interest and academically, rather than loving his books. And you know, there is quite a lot of racism within Rudyard Kipling. That is something you need to be prepared to find in his work. This sounds kind of interesting, actually. So I don't know, maybe I'll read this one day. Next we have Guy Livingstone by George Lawrence. This is a mid-Victorian novel. Haven't heard of George Lawrence, haven't heard of Guy Livingstone. Very interesting, because I do feel like I've heard of a lot of Victorian authors. You know, as I said, I made a video series about 100 Victorian authors. But there are still many Victorian authors who I have not heard of and haven't come across. It's possible I've forgotten some names of people I've come across before. But yeah, interesting. This doesn't necessarily sound like a book that I would absolutely love, but yeah. Okay, now we've got some Charles Lever, who I think was a 19th century Irish writer. So one is set during the Napoleonic Wars, and one of them early 19th century, so possibly also Napoleonic Wars. I've never heard of Charles Lever. Don't know if anyone else has heard of Charles Lever, but yeah. Maybe sometime I will give him a go. Next we have The Atonement of Liam Dunas by Eliza Lynn Linton. I have heard of Eliza Lynn Linton. I'm not sure I've heard of this book specifically. Actually, now I'm reading the description of it, I feel like I have heard of this one. A woman who, after her father's death, is left to carry a secret that leads to a tragic mistake. I'm pretty sure I have read this description or a similar description of this before. So I think this is one of the ones that's vaguely on my radar from my kind of 100 Victorian authors project. So yeah, maybe I'll give this one a go at some point soon. Next we have Handy Andy by Samuel Lover. What a name for a book. This is a humorous novel set in early 19th century Ireland about the misadventures of a bumbling protagonist. There's another novel by Samuel Lover. I haven't heard of Samuel Lover before, but we've also got Rory O'More, which is set in 18th century Ireland against the backdrop of political unrest, and about a character who gets involved in the struggle for his country's independence up against British rule. That sounds much more interesting than the previous one. I'd be quite interested to read that actually, so I'm going to make a note of that one. That novel was first published in 1800, I think, and that sounds quite interesting. Now we have some Edward Bulwer Lytton. So we've got 4 novels by Edward Bulwer Lytton. We've got The Last of the Barons, which I haven't read, Night and Morning, which I have read, Rienzi, which I haven't read, and The Caxtons, which I haven't read. So the only Edward Bulwer Lytton book I have read is Night and Morning, which I thought was fantastic, really interesting bildungsroman with lots of interesting social criticism in, one to read, I think, if you like Charles Dickens. But I'm really interested to read more by Edward Bulwer Lytton because he wrote quite a lot of novels and they're all quite different by the sounds of things, or at least he wrote in quite a lot of different kind of genres and areas. You know, The Last of the Barons is a historical novel set during the War of the Roses. Rienzi is a historical novel set in 14th century Italy. And The Caxtons is a kind of 19th century family drama, I guess. So I definitely want to read more by Edward Bulwer Lytton because I really liked Night and Morning. I'm really keen to read The Vril or The Coming Race. It's published under both titles. That's not on this list, but it sounds very interesting. I would also be quite interested to read The Caxtons. Edward Bulwer Lytton is one of those authors who was very, very famous and successful in the 19th century, is not super in favour now. Like, I think a lot of his books are out of print, but I think some elements of his books kind of remain in popular culture. So he was the author who wrote a book that began, "It was a dark and stormy night," which you probably heard of, and I think there are a few other kind of phrases he wrote that are still quite well known. Okay, now we've got some Frederick Marryat. We've got 4 books by him. We've got The King's Own, Peter Simple, Jacob Faithful, and Midshipman Easy. I have read some Frederick Marryat, but I haven't read any of these books. The only book by him I've read is The Children of the New Forest, which I think is definitely like his most famous book, although I feel like it's probably one of those books that was more famous 30 years ago than it is now. I haven't read any of these books. I'm kind of interested to read something more by Frederick Marryat, but I think if I do, it will probably be his novel The Phantom Ship, which is a kind of like naval ghost story, which I think appeals to me more than his just kind of like general naval Napoleonic War set stuff, which I think it seems like quite a few of these are. Now we're on to Diana of the Crossways by George Meredith. So I haven't read this, but it's very high up on my list. I definitely want to get to this one soon. I love George Meredith. I've read a few of his books, The Egoist and Richard Featherall, and I've also read some of his poetry, but I haven't read Diana of the Crossways, but I really, really want to. It's meant to be great. So it's quite exciting actually to see this as the George Meredith book on this list rather than The Egoist, which is the one that is still in print today. Diana of the Crossways is, I believe, George Meredith's like new woman novel. And considering how like feminist I found The Egoist, I'm really excited to read his take on kind of the new woman. It was inspired by a real life figure, and it's about a woman who is trapped in an unhappy marriage and kind of her attempts to free herself from that. And yeah, I'm excited for that. But now we get to a book I have read. I feel like we haven't had one of them for ages. Here is John Halifax Gentleman by Dinah Mullet Craik, which is a wonderful novel that I really love and highly recommend. I really like Diana Mullett-Craik. She's a fantastic writer who is relatively forgotten now. I feel like not that many of her novels are well known. John Halifax Gentleman is probably still her best known book, but I don't think it's hugely well known. I love her novel Olive. That's my favourite thing that I've read by her, but I also really like John Halifax Gentleman, and I've read some other stuff by her too. But yeah, John Halifax Gentleman is a really great, interesting coming of age story. It's kind of about John Halifax, but it's told from the perspective of his best friend, and it's kind of all about social mobility and love and so many other things in the Victorian period, and it's just great. Next, another book I haven't read but really want to is Under Two Flags by Ouida. I've heard good things about Under Two Flags, and I have read a little bit from Ouida before. I've read one of her plays, but I haven't read any of her novels. I'm really keen to read Under Two Flags. I think it'd be a really, really interesting novel, but yes, not one I have read yet. So now we've got some Charles Reade. Got quite a few novels, 3 novels by Charles Reade. I haven't read any Charles Reade of yet, but I have heard of him. So we've got It Is Never Too Late to Mend, Peg Woffington and Christy Johnston, and Hard Cash. What wild names. Charles Reade is best known, I think, for The Cloister and the Hearth. I haven't heard of these, and judging from the fact that the only cover the creator of the list could find for It Is Never Too Late to Mend is not in English, I'm assuming it's not very well known. I'm kind of interested to read Hard Cash, because what an unusual name for a Victorian novel. So yeah, I feel like if I were to read some Charles Reade, it would probably be The Cloister and the Hearth, not these. But yeah, interesting always to see books that were thought of very highly and have been a little forgotten. The Headless Horseman by Thomas Mayne Reid. So I haven't read this, but it does ring a bell. This is an American novel from the 1860s. Probably wouldn't be very high up my list to read. Now we have Virginia of Virginia by Amelie Rives Trubetsky. This is a historical romance set in the late 18th century. Not a novel that I have heard of at all. Next is The Story of an African Farm by Olive Schreiner. So I haven't read this, but I have heard of it. It is a book that I would be interested to read at some point, but there are probably other books that I'm more excited to get to first. Now we have Tom Cringle's Log by Michael Scott, and Cruise of the Midge by Michael Scott. Not an author who I have heard of. Looks like he is a late 18th, early 19th century Scottish writer, writing chiefly about kind of like naval adventures. So probably wouldn't be super high up my list, but interesting to see on this list. Then next we have Quo Vadis by Henrik Sienkiewicz. I hope I'm saying that correctly. This does vaguely ring a bell. I feel like I have heard of Quo Vadis, but not one that I've read. Sienkiewicz was a Polish writer, but this book is set in ancient Rome. So yeah, maybe I will get to this at some point. I do not know. Now we have some Walter Scott. I don't think it's going to be any of the Walter Scott books I've read, but oh my goodness, what a lot of Walter Scott there is. I have actually read one of them. Okay, let's go from the beginning. Walter Scott died in 1832, but he continued to be very well regarded for the bulk of the 19th century, and he was considered kind of one of the great novelists in 19th century Britain. He has definitely fallen out of favour a bit now. Like, I sometimes hear people talk about Walter Scott, but not masses. I've read 2 of his books. I quite like them. I would be interested in reading more, but there are definitely a lot of other authors I'm more excited to read more from. But it's interesting to see that there is a lot of Walter Scott on this list. He was obviously very well respected by the 1890s creators of this list. So we have Rob Roy, The Bride of Lammermoor, Old Mortality, Kenilworth, Guy Mannering, Woodstock, The Talisman. I have read The Talisman, and I actually thought The Talisman was really good. I picked this one up not knowing anything about it. The reason why I read it was because it was the only Walter Scott I could find easy access to on audiobook. And then I started reading it and realised that it was a historical novel set during the Crusades. And I thought, this is not a book that is going to be a super comfortable read for a modern reader. It's probably going to be exceptionally racist. But actually, considering when it was written, I thought it had quite like a nuanced and complicated view on the differences between Islam and Christianity. So I enjoyed The Talisman. I do want to read more by Sir Walter Scott. It's interesting that Waverley isn't on here. That's the other book I've read by him, which I always think of as his most famous novel, but obviously was not considered the greatest in the 1890s. So interesting. Moving on from the Walter Scott, we get to Frank Fairley by Francis Edward Smedley. Not a novel I've ever heard of. Apparently a kind of 19th century Bildungsroman, I guess. Next we have The Adventures of Roderick Random by Tobias Smollett. This does ring a bell to me. And we've got two Tobias Smollett novels here. The other one is The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle. Both of these ring a bell to me. The titles, not the name of the author actually, but yes, where are these novels from? So these are mid-18th century novels, I think, and you know, I would be keen to read some more 18th century literature at some point. I feel like I haven't read very much of it, and a lot of what I've read I haven't found that exciting, but you know, that's probably because I just need to read more and find the right books and the right authors. Here we have On the Face of the Waters by Flora Annie Steele. Not a novel that I've read. The author's name maybe vaguely rings a bell, but I'm not sure. But it is set in 1857 in India and was written in the 1890s, so I don't know how likely it is to be very sensitive. Although it sounds like it's maybe more nuanced than you might expect for a book written in the 1890s about this subject. But hard to say. Probably one of those books I would read like out of intellectual interest, more than expecting to love it. But yeah. Next we have The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne, and I really must read Tristram Shandy. This is one of those books that I have been vaguely meaning to read for ages and just never do. But this is a mid-18th century novel that is told in a like non-linear, unusual fashion. I've heard very good things about this. It's still very, very famous. And I've heard some people compare it to the posthumous memoirs of Brascubas by Machado de Assis, which is a novel I love. So that makes me really keen to try and read Tristram Shandy at some point in the future. Next we have Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which I'm not at all surprised to see on this list. This was a very like well-regarded book throughout the 19th century. I feel like it's one of those books that if I were to read, I would be reading it for, you know, intellectual curiosity, not expecting to enjoy it. I imagine it would be quite an uncomfortable read as a modern reader, but I do think it would be a kind of interesting read to read as someone who's really interested in Victorian British history, because Uncle Tom's Cabin was hugely successful in Britain. A lot of people within Victorian society would have read it, and it was really instrumental in kind of shaping opinions about slavery and America within Britain. So I would be kind of interested to read it at some point. Next we have Soapy Sponge's Sporting Tour by Robert Smith Surtees. This vaguely rings a bell for me, but it's not one that I have read. Another Victorian book. I guess a lot of Victorian literature just does like ring a bell for me vaguely. Here we have The Wandering Jew by Eugene Sue. This is not a novel that I have read, but I have heard of it before, and I have heard positive things, I think. I'm not really sure, to be honest. It's just one of those books that rings a bell rather than one I know much about. So now we have some William Makepeace Thackeray. We've got 3 books by him, none of which are Vanity Fair, which is definitely his most famous book today by a very long way. So here we have The History of Henry Esmond, which I haven't read. This is a historical novel. Then we have The Newcomes, which I haven't read but I want to read. This is probably like the next book I will read by Thackeray. This is set in mid-19th century society and is a satirical novel, a bit like Vanity Fair, I suppose, in tone. And here we have The Memoirs of Barry Lyndon, which I have read and I really, really didn't like. I did not think that The Memoirs of Barry Lyndon was good at all. Definitely not a book that I enjoyed. I found Barry Lyndon like both a bit boring, and also I found the main character so utterly infuriating. So yes, Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy I have also read. Interesting that it's Anna Karenina on here, not War and Peace. I love Anna Karenina very much. I think it is fantastic. And I love it more than War and Peace, actually. But War and Peace is kind of the more well-respected one. Anna Karenina is also very well-respected and very famous, and remains very famous in the modern day. But yes. And here we come to Anthony Trollope. One novel only by Anthony Trollope. Anthony Trollope deserves so many more slots on this list. Interesting that it's Orley Farm, because Orley Farm still remains known a bit, I guess. I do think it is one of his best. Like, I really love Orley Farm. I think it's a fantastic novel, quite a good place to start with Anthony Trollope, and it's really great. But he has like 47 novels to choose from. Maybe it was one of his most famous ones at the time, I don't know. I would say that his most like well-known books today are probably like the Barsetshire Chronicles. Maybe He Knew He Was Right and The Way We Live Now, but not Orley Farm. It is still in print, I believe, which many of his books aren't. But yeah, interesting. Okay, Robert Elsmere by Mary Augusta Ward. I haven't read that one, but I have heard of Mary Augusta Ward. And I have heard good things about her, so maybe I will try one of her books at some point in the future. Then we have 10,000 a Year by Samuel Warren. Not a novel that I've heard of. This book is about a shop clerk who inherits a fortune of £10,000 a year and then gets thrust into society and struggles within it. That sounds very similar to Kip by H.G. Wells. Interesting. I might like to read that at some point. That sounds like a novel I might find interesting. Then we have The Wide, Wide World by Elizabeth Wetherell. It looks like this is a 19th century American novel, not one that I have come across. The author's name doesn't really ring a bell. Here we have George White Melville, who was apparently a Scottish writer. I haven't read Market Harborough or Inside the Bar. And considering Market Harborough is about fox hunting, I do not think that is a book that I have any inclination to read. I have far more fox hunting than I ever want to read about within the novels of Anthony Trollope. I love his books, but I wish he would write less about fox hunting. Okay, we've got another page. I assume there aren't many books to go. Just one book to go, East Lynne by Ellen Wood. What a great book, though. What a wonderful book to end the list on. I love East Lynne by Ellen Wood. Fantastic, fantastic sensation novel with wonderful characters, wonderful plot. I really, really love it a lot and I highly recommend it. So let me have a quick check of how many books of the list that I've read, and I'm also going to have a look, as well as the kind of list, there is also like a table with lists of like the years and countries of the book, and I'm going to have a look at like some statistics because I think it would be quite interesting. Hello again. I've stopped sharing my screen because I was just doing some quick statistics, and I'll just read from my screen instead. So of the books on this list, I've read 25 of them, so I've read 25%. I've read a quarter of the books on the list, which is fairly satisfying, and probably about what I would expect. And there were also a few authors where I had read from them but not the book on the list. So yeah, I also had a quick look at other statistics to do with the list, which I think are very interesting, and you know, reflect the kind of biases I was expecting from a list of 100 best books produced in 1890s Britain. So of the books on the list, 91% of them were originally written in the English language, so only 9% in translation. 74% of the books were British books, 10% of them were books from the USA, 8% of books were French literature, and 5% were Irish literature, and then there were like a handful of other countries dotted in there, but not very many. I was expecting it to be a very British literature dominated list, being produced in 1890s Britain, but yes, very, very British dominated. There are also only 5 books from before the 19th century, so 95% of the list are 19th century books, and then there are 5 books from the 18th century. And I find it really interesting that it's such a 19th century dominated list, because obviously, like, the 19th century was in many ways, you know, the age of the novel, but there were quite a lot of novels being published in the 18th century, and it's interesting that there's only 5 books from before that point. And there are also quite a few, like, very famous pre-19th century novels that are still in print today that aren't on this list, like Gulliver's Travels or Robinson Crusoe or The Vicar of Wakefield. Like, I would have kind of expected those books to be on this list. Pilgrim's Progress, I would have expected that to be on this list. So it's interesting that it wasn't. That these are books that are still well known today, but also that I know were well regarded in the Victorian period. And, you know, maybe people in the Victorian period all read this list and were like, oh, what nonsense, why isn't this included? I'm sure they did. Maybe I'll have to see if I can do a deep dive and like find any reviews, responses to this from the time, because if it was a newspaper article, surely people would have responded in some way. Anyway, I don't know. And then yes, 83% of the authors were male authors and 17% of them were women authors. I'm not hugely surprised by this split. It was the 1890s, but I probably would have thought it would be more 70-30, and there are quite a lot of like well-known, well-respected female authors who I would have expected to see on this list. You know, I would have expected to see Maria Edgeworth or Fanny Burney on this list, Fanny Trollope, Margaret Oliphant. It would have been lovely to see her on this list, but I probably wasn't expecting that. I knew she was very, very popular and sold her books very, very well in the Victorian period, but wasn't super well respected. partly because she was a woman, let's be honest. But yeah, I also found it interesting that there were quite a few authors where they had a lot of their books. Like, to have 7 books by Sir Walter Scott, that is like, that's such a big proportion of the list. Like, 7% of your list to be one author. Like, I know he was well respected and beloved in the 19th century, but like, that's a lot of Walter Scott. There are also lots of books by Charles Dickens and Edward Bulwer Lytton, and there are quite a few authors where they had many of their books, which I thought was interesting. And also very interesting that that isn't true for the female writers. The only female writer they have more than one book by, no, actually, they've got 2 books by Charlotte Bronte, and they've got 2 books by Jane Austen. Interesting, actually, that none of the other Brontes are on this list. You know, it's interesting that not only are there not very many female writers on this list, but the female writers get a lot fewer books to their names than the male writers. Overall, it was a very fascinating process to go through this list and have a look at it. Find it very historically interesting. One, that people were making lists of best books in 1899, but also to look back on what they thought were the best books and which of these have been remembered, which haven't. And also, you know, how the biases of the time would have influenced that list as they would any list, I'm sure. So yeah, that was a very, very interesting exercise. I think I'm gonna wrap up the video here. Do let me know your thoughts down in the comments. How many of these books had you heard of? How many have you read? Were there a lot of books that you hadn't heard of? I'd be interested to know, especially some of the like American books I'd never heard of. Have you heard of them if you were in the US? And yeah, that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.